Suddenly, I have strong opinions on Dune, just coincidentally around a big tentpole. Actually, it's even worse than that, right? Because I have to write and shoot this a week before, so no one could give a fuck about Dune right now. But obviously, when you're watching this, all the content creators will be releasing their takes, just secretly having their takes to themselves and then releasing them when it's optimal for engagement. It's almost as if they don't care about anything at all and are just hungry for clicks. Now, I'm not going to be saying Dune. I believe the proper pronunciation is Dune, and I'll be saying June on account of my lazy accent. Now, there's been a lot of attempts to make it into a movie. David Lynch made one that people seem to kind of hate. Jodorowsky famously failed to make one. So it's kind of a popular clickbait article title now. Like, is a Dune movie even possible? And yes, yeah, obviously it is. Now, it's supposedly the best-selling sci-fi novel of all time, which isn't strictly true if you go by facts, but it is a sentence that people seem to say. So odds are good you haven't read Dune, and if you did, you probably didn't finish it. So I don't know why you clicked on this video, but it's great to have you. Since you haven't read it, Dune is about a prince called Paul, who is the result of an intergenerational eugenics-based breeding program, and he goes with his family to take over control of a desert planet, but they fail, so he has to run away into the desert where he realizes that he has inbred superpowers. So he becomes a god to the desert people, and they ride back into town on giant worms and win. Now, my history of having slightly contrary takes that should piss off fans, but doing it in a way that's so well researched and nuanced that I face no backlash, will not come into play here. The freaks down there are not going to be happy about this one. There's this idea that you can't adapt Dune because it's so dense. Now, I don't think the book is that dense, it's just bad. It all started when Frank Herbert's wife went to work full-time in advertising, and that gave him the opportunity to stop working as a Republican speechwriter and start researching sand dunes. And he researched sand dunes so much that he wanted to write a book about them. So after about 5 years, he wrote a draft about an ecologist heroically terraforming a planet. Eventually it got picked up as a serial in Analog magazine called Dune World, and Dune World is just the first third of the final book. This clashing of royal houses and failing to take over the desert planet, sort of like a fantasy political intrigue spy type thing. And then it got picked up for a sequel serial, and that's where he added in all this white savior worm riding schlock. The first serial is solid. It's solid. Over the course of writing it though, he started to change his mind about science, particularly this idea of man interfering with nature. Increasingly, he felt that this ecologist character in his drafts represented Western man out of step with the natural world. So by the time he got to the first serial, that role had been reduced to a side character, and by the second serial, Frank kills him off for his hubris. I bring this up now because Frank Herbert has a very evolving outlook. He's constantly trying to recontextualize and reconfigure his own work to reflect his complex and evolving views, which is good, right? That's the creative process. Now, Frank was basically a weird guy. He was very scared of JFK and welfare and the idea of paying his taxes, but he was very into drugs and environmentalism. He felt that humans naturally fell into feudalism, that was the natural way of things. And he felt that the best way to manage that was imperial rule. Particularly, he felt that the Roman Empire was the closest that we'd come to an ideal political system. But he also distrusted all politics and anyone in power, which all sort of culminates into hippie-ish conservatism, right? Politics bad, and you should just work on yourself. Now, I don't want to get into too much of a book review. It's not my thing. All I can really offer there is the idiot's opinion. It is what I'm going to do, but I just thought I'd flag that up. You know, I'm not too keen on the idea myself. I think there's a bit of a misconception that Dune is a difficult read because it's so clever. It's not, it's just poorly written. You're not struggling to read it because it's so politically complex. He just can't write a sentence to save himself. The dialogue is clunky to the extreme, the pacing is notably fucked, and throughout the book, he repeatedly tries to write in-universe poetry and song, which is always deeply embarrassing, and I think betrays a complete lack of understanding of all human culture. Also, not a particularly big book. They just print it with really big words. I think so that you finish the pages quicker, and that the mad dopamine rush of that helps you to slog through it. But I don't know that he really wanted to be a fiction writer. He's at his best when he's writing long, uninterrupted stretches of raw exposition, or there's some, fake articles in the back of the book. That stuff is perfectly competent. The best parts of the book are finding out about the life cycles of worms and stuff. And I think for a lot of people, that makes up for the weak rest of the book. But it annoys me particularly. I personally hate it when world building is put first, and this is literally world building put first. He started with research on sand dunes and then wrote a story as a vehicle to showcase. I don't really read fiction to find out about facts you've imagined. Oh, I thought of a planet that has its own ecosystem. Yeah, that's fucking great, dude. Don't write a book about it though. And I don't know that any of this is even controversial. Some people are willing to overlook this stuff because of the book's contributions to the genre. Other people are sure that this is actually meta deconstruction. It's written clunkily as a next level storytelling tool or as a criticism of the genre or something, which I think suggests a level of irony and self-awareness that is not only far beyond the reach of this book, but any book from the 60s. People weren't doing meta deconstruction then. But it opens with this really excellent scene, right, where Paul has to put his hand in a box filled with pain, which is just off the bat great imagery. In fact, this new movie seems to be marketed almost entirely off the back of that scene. This is as good as it gets. While this is happening, we're also finding out about the secret order of witches controlling politics behind the scenes and trying to breed a Superman through a eugenics program. Which is obviously our hero, Paul. And that's not a spoiler because Frank Herbert tells you that before the book begins. He puts a fake historical quote at the top of each chapter to make sure that all plot developments are tediously expected. Now, there is a bit of talk, as there is around any movie coming out in 2021, about how strong the women characters are. Now, I'm not sure if a story where all women are conniving witches consumed by the concept of reproduction counts as a win for feminism. I'm not sure about that. Now, as we follow this royal family over to the desert planet, the plot thickens. It's an obvious trap, and they find out there's a traitor in their midst. Again, this is all plot development that's spoiled up front. Anything that could be an interesting twist is ruined hundreds of times before it happens. The book has this very off-putting, close third-person omniscient perspective where you see all the characters' thoughts written out. It's maybe him trying to, make it more understandable, cram some more exposition in, but really it just leads to a lot of tedious and grinding repetition. We have this traitor character, and rather than having people act suspicious or whatever, we just see into this character's thoughts over and over again, and him just going, boy, I hope no one finds out that I'm the traitor. It's all tell, no show, to an extreme that I've never seen before. And on top of that, some of the characters have some light mind control and telepathy, which never feels natural. They both feel like crutches, mind control so that he can make people do things. How can I have a character that's persuasive? And telepathy for him to grapple with the idea of reading human emotion. It's like in TNG, where they had to introduce a superpowered species to explain to nerds the concept of having empathy. Now, once they finally get betrayed, right at the end of the serial, our protagonist has to flee with his mum into the desert. And we reach our first bit of character development. Basically, the desert is so saturated with a magic psychedelic that just hanging out there for a bit starts to unlock Paul's superpowers, and he becomes more insufferable. The only character development that happens in this story is through literal chemical changes that happen to Paul at scheduled intervals. Like, there's no human growth. I mean, some stories get away with that, no character development, but you have a range of characters that are interesting in their own ways, but every character in Dune is the same. You could swap any bit of dialogue between any character and it wouldn't be out of place. Everyone is a cold, calculating Also, awkwardly, this means that in this story, even though eugenics is painted as a manipulative and bitchy thing to do, it is true and does work. And that's where the first serial ends. And then the second serial is just, you know, at this point plot just starts happening for the sake of it. There's no real character motivation or plot drive. There's no real reason why anyone does the things that they do other than the plot needs to happen. We're introduced to a love interest with no setup or dialogue, just, you know, oh, here's a love interest, okay, bye. And then Paul becomes a god to the desert people who are broadly some kind of Arab analog. And look, if I wanted to hear a 1960s American reactionary's views on Arab culture, I'd listen to a Joe Biden speech. No, please, I'm joking. Please. I have no idea what I'm saying. Please, cuff me, boys, take me away. Unbelievable. What am I doing? But that is an established criticism of this stuff, that it's a nasty, reactionary, white savior story written by a 1960s Republican. Half of Dune fans will reply, yes, isn't it great? While the other half will go, no, actually it's a meta deconstruction of the idea of heroes. Because at the same time as winning, Paul knows that his actions are going to cause genocide. And between book 1 and 2, his actions here result in 65 billion deaths. And by the 80s, Frank Herbert was explicitly saying that Dune was a series about how you shouldn't trust heroes. And I can see how you would read it that way, right? When your protagonist realizes that his actions are going to cause mass genocide and continues doing them anyway, you reasonably assume that that's not meant as a good thing. But it's complicated a bit because Paul is a flawless self-insert of Frank Herbert. If I were ever going to use the phrase Mary Sue, and his actions reflect Frank Herbert's views at the time. In talking about the books, he explicitly describes Paul in book 1 as a hero and Paul in book 2 as an anti-hero, where I think anyone's current understanding would be that Paul in book 1 is an anti-hero at best, transitioning into a villain when he causes genocide. What Frank was trying to do here was explore moral relativism. As he put it in an interview at the time, Paul is forced to choose between a moral decision and an ethical one. Right? Morally, he knows that he shouldn't commit genocide, but ethically, if he doesn't, something worse will happen. And that worse thing is the stagnation of human evolution. Frank Herbert believed that some people were genetically superior to others. He was very strong on that, and he was also interested in this idea that you're just a vehicle being driven by your genes' desires to evolve. So the space witches have been controlling genes through eugenics, which he believes does work, but he also believes that science shouldn't interfere with nature. So they must be stopped because their control will force the human race to stagnate. Meanwhile, Paul is destined to become a god, which he must do, or he'll be going against his genetic destiny. And the desert people are destined to either be colonized or commit extreme mass-scale genocide, which Paul must facilitate as a way of reversing the Space Witch's stagnation and evening out the galactic gene pool. It's not a clever meta-critique of white saviorism to have Arab stand-ins with no agency easily goaded into fulfilling their genetic destiny of killing everyone in a religious war. That is just doing the white savior trope at face value. Actually, it's worse, I think. That's worse than just doing the white savior trope at face value. Now, I'm not saying that you should dismiss the books because of Frank Herbert's insane views, but it definitely means that he's not doing deconstruction, right? It's not deconstruction, it's a sincere attempt at the hero's journey written by a weird guy. And of course you can still engage with it ironically, just because that's not necessarily the intent doesn't mean that, you know, you're wrong for reading it that way. And I think this is why people are so obsessed with the possibility of Dune adaptations. Everyone who wasted their time on this book is imagining their own version of it that's better than the book itself. Now, Dune was first optioned in 1971, and people failed to make it into a movie for a few years. Then in 1974, the rights passed to Alejandro Jodorowsky, and he got really high and was like, I want to spend $1 bajillion and make the most incredible movie of all time, and everyone famous is going to be in it. And it's going to star my son, and it's going to be 14 hours and long, everyone will love it. Incredibly, that fell apart. He blew the budget in pre-production. It's kind of one of those famous missed opportunities, and I kind of wish that it had been made, because it obviously would have been so fucking bad, you'd have to stop being annoying about it. Then in 1976, Dino De Laurentiis acquired the rights. Ridley Scott worked on it for a bit before he dropped out, and eventually it passed on to David Lynch. Now, beyond Frank Herbert's more specific views, the emphasis on a general anti-political hippie-ish conservatism and transcendental experience make David Lynch a pretty good pick for director. And the first draft, which he wrote with the screenwriters of The Elephant Man, is really very good. It just covers the first serial, the good half of the book, and it just tightens the bolts, inserts dramatic tension where it should be, removes unnecessary exposition, and gives all the characters a unique and empathetic characterization. But otherwise it's pretty straightforward and faithful to the book, which was not the Star Wars ripoff that Dino De Laurentiis was looking for. So on his own, David Lynch spent another year doing drafts of the script. He had to incorporate the whole of the book, and I'd say he pretty quickly made the decision to interpret the book's messy, schlocky back half as unrestrained camp. He also reintroduced the internal monologues from the book, which is a very bizarre choice. But it reminds me a lot of the Twin Peaks scripts. If you look at a Lynch-directed episode and compare the script to the final product, the script is messy and on the nose and embarrassing, but in shooting and editing, he works every moment into a more abstract and interesting representation of what's on the page. But over the course of making Dune, it spiraled out of control, and by the time it got to editing, he basically wasn't involved and couldn't be involved. I think the story goes that Lynch's assembly edit was like 5 or 6 hours long, and then that was cut down to a 3-hour one, and then they got a generic editor guy to trim it down into 2 hours, which ruined the movie. But who knows? The final result is a mess. It's fun though, it has its moments, and I think the worst of it, the back half, the inner monologues, the sudden love interest, the worm writing, the messy ending, and the general stupidity is all lifted straight from the book. So a David Lynch cut wouldn't really improve that, but I can see that as a whole, there is a slightly better movie in there. You can see that just giving the dialogue time to breathe, even though those inner monologues are on the page, I don't know that they were necessarily going to make it. You can see that just holding on the actors as they pause and think would create a mood that he is known for. But we'll never know, and he definitely doesn't want to revisit it. And I think the best thing that came out of that movie is that David Lynch was fully ready to sell out, but he fucked it up and instead had to make stuff that's actually good. Then there was the miniseries and some more failed attempts. Apparently people like the miniseries. I've not seen it. Actually, I saw a little bit of it and I thought it was too embarrassing to persist with, but there you go. But now we have New Dune by Denis Villeneuve. Apparently it covers just the first half of the serial. Apparently it's very faithful to the source material. It's basically what David Lynch was trying to do in the first place, which obviously is going to be fine. But I can't imagine that it's going to be an approach that works going into a sequel because of the poor quality source material. So I don't know. I suspect we're on the brink of a pissing match about whether Dune is too problematic. It is being marketed as a woke thing, and of course they will be taking some ironic distance from Frank's story, but it's still ultimately using the hero's journey to push some very dark and cynical ideas. So I don't particularly think a remake of Dune is what we need right now, though I'm sure people will be saying that. A remake of Dune is exactly what we need right now. It's more relevant than ever, but maybe it is what we deserve. So there you go. Once again, I've delved into a sci-fi franchise that I previously had no interest in, and I've come out nonplussed. What's wrong with me?